QSO Today, episode 532, Ian Flemming G3ZDQ. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I try to get on the air every day. I didn't think that I'd enjoy FT8 as much as I do. FT8 has easily demonstrated to me that my relatively simple multiband inverted V antenna seems to work the world from Israel, and how propagation on the frequencies above 14 megahertz changes as night falls. Since Vera AC was invented here, I do operate it a tiny bit and hope to have more time for other modes in the future. The IC7300 seems to be the perfect rig for base station use, and I hope to take the QRP Labs radios into parks as my health improves even more. All in all, I am operating HF now more than ever than I ever have in my amateur radio career. Just a reminder that the response to my amateur radio events calendar has been great. You can get to it from the banner link on the show notes page. The calendar is updated by you, and I hope that it will become the most comprehensive amateur radio events calendar. Please use it and update it with your ham radio events. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Ian Flemming, G3ZDQ, grew up tuning mysterious signals on his grandfather's radio in northwest England, a spark that led to a lifelong journey through classic gear, pioneering microprocessor work, Raynet emergency communications, digital modes, canal boat portable QRP operations, and the restoration of iconic British radios from KW Electronics and Eddystone. His story weaves technical curiosity, professional engineering, and a deep love for radio's evolving technologies, from Hartley transmitters and 6146 finals to modern digital modes. G3ZDQ is my QSO Today. G3ZDQ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ian?
Yes, indeed. 4Z1UG, G3ZDQ. Ian replying. Very good afternoon to you, Eric.
Good afternoon, Ian. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I think the first recollections I've got must be when I was about 10 years old. And I was playing with my granddad's radio, one of the tall wooden ones with the dial lamps. I think he'd been listening to something BBC. And I tuned the dial, and I started to hear Morse code. What I was to learn was Morse code. My uncle, Glyn, was with me at the time, and he explained what it was. And he said it's people using Morse code, those dits and doshes, to communicate with each other. And probably they're quite close to the trawler band as well. So he explained, there's radio communication going on, and I was sort of fascinated at that point. So that's the start of the progress on my ham radio career.
What's the trawler band? What does that mean?
Round about 1.8 to 2 megahertz, 2 to 2.5 megahertz is where the trawlers used to communicate between themselves and between the coastal stations, using AM in those days and a little bit of Morse code, I think. But we call it the fishbone part of the band.
The fishbone part of the band.
Yeah, 160 meters, that sort of area.
What was the hometown when you were growing up?
Originally, I came from the northwest of the UK, northwest of England. It's just south of Manchester, a place called New Mills. And that's where I grew up, in the Derbyshire Hills and the Pennine Mountains, the Pennine Mountain Range.
And the current QTH is where?
Well, we're down right on the south coast of the UK now, about 35 miles west of Southampton, in the county of Dorset. So it's rolling downlands, chalk downlands, and not far from what we call the Jurassic Coast, which is an area where a lot of fossils have been discovered.
Jurassic Coast. Okay, so that makes sense with the... and what kind of fossils do they find down there? Do they find large reptile type?
No, but they're doing down from the small ammonites, and they found dinosaur footprints, a whole range of creatures that, died and fossilized in the sediments of the old seas that were around this area billions of years ago.
So Uncle Glenn explained to you that you were listening to Morse code, probably from the trawler band or something like that. Where did that go? I mean, what happened after that?
I remember one evening, my parents and Glenn and his wife were invited to another friend's in New Mills. And I was, I suppose, about 10, 11 years old at the time. Too young to leave by myself. And they said, well, you come with us and, I'm sure we can find something for you to do. Well, they went off and they had their drinks and listened to their hi-fi. And the visit was to a place that was owned by a radio ham, Harold McCormick, G3ZDQ. And Harold had a radio station. He had his own company, but he had an office at home. And in his office at home, he had a separate desk. And I was introduced to two pieces of equipment on that desk. One was a Hallicrafters SX111 communications receiver. And sitting next to it was a KW Viceroy single sideband transmitter manufactured by KW Electronics in the UK. And he said, would you like me to show you my radio station? So I said yes. And it was dark evening. He turned the radio on, this beautiful dial lamps lit up. And it was just a beautiful thing to see. And I could hear all these different radio stations chatting to each other. And then he picked the microphone up and he called the station. And I remember it to this day. I don't remember the whole call sign, but it was a 4x4 station. It was the very first station I heard on 80 meters using that KW Viceroy transmitter and a V-beam antenna pointing out to the southeast. That was my second step into ham radio and electronics.
So the first contact you heard Harold make for you was an Israeli station.
It was indeed, yeah.
Yeah, how about that? Well, that's really cool. How did it proceed in terms of your ultimately getting a license?
Well, as you know, with ham radio, there's a lot of people that help you and encourage you along the way. Glenn was very instrumental in helping me move forward. He was a radio operator and navigator and a rear gunner in the Royal Air Force back in World War II, which is where he got his interest in radio communications. And he collected some surplus bits and pieces. And I think that's how he got to know Harold, G3ZDQ. And they were both in the RAF together. And over a short period of time, I started to ask about shortwave listening. And the first thing Glenn did was to give me a small broadcast radio, little Bakelite, 5-valve, AC/DC, no mains transformer radio. And, I listened to the pirate radio stations in the UK, the pop stations, Radio Caroline and all those sort of things. And then I thought, well, top band, 1.8 megahertz, 1.9 megahertz is not too far away from medium wave. I wonder if I can tweak this radio. And I managed to get some help to move the radio down a bit, and you could hear the AM stations on top of it. And over a period of years, I saved up enough money to buy my first communications receiver, which was the R1155 that was used in the Lancaster bomber. Because in those days, there was a surplus of military equipment on the market, and it came on the market very cheap, and there were shops in most of the big cities where you could go along and you could browse shelves of components, radios, transmitters. They're often, they're weighing 50 pounds, 60 pounds, huge pieces of equipment, but relatively inexpensive. And, as a schoolboy, I could save up for 6 months or a year, and I could afford one of these. And bought my first radio, which is an R1155.
And were you also doing other kinds of electronics in those days?
I still had the dial.
Oh, that's cool. So for those listening on audio, Ian's showing me the dial from the R1155. Well, that's very cool. Were you doing other kinds of electronics at the same time? And did you have peers that were also at the same time having some kind of interest in radio and electronics?
Yeah, I at that time, I was in transition between what I call primary school up to the age of 11 and going into the next stage of education, secondary school, the grammar school. And 4 or 5 of my peers were interested in physics, chemistry, and we had a sort of an empathy with electronics. And I remember constructing a number of Heathkit projects, the Heathkit valve voltmeter, the Heathkit oscilloscope for use in the physics lab. So, we gradually were stimulated to build these pieces of equipment as tools for our education. And very slowly, we sort of started to experiment with electronics. So we were making very, very elementary computers using 1287 double triode valves, and of course making the power supplies to go with those. Nothing too adventurous, could count up to 128 with it, using decatrons and display technology that was current at that time. So yes, we did go into other areas of electronics, but it was relatively simple. But we did have a little room assigned to us. We made it a little radio club, and it was stuffed full of QST magazines that local radio amateurs had donated. And, we did repairs on little radios and that sort of thing. But we never had a ham radio station, unfortunately. But it was in that secondary school education period that me and my colleagues decided that we'd like to take the next step forward, which is the radio amateurs exam. And in the UK, that was a qualification hosted by the City and Guilds of London. So we all signed up for a course at Stockport Technical College. It was an evening course, and it ran for the best part of 6 to 9 months, I think. But it was myself and a number of colleagues, chemistry master, who went one evening a week for, quite a length of time. And at the end of that course, fortunately, we all passed the radio amateurs examination, which was the first prerequisite for getting a license in those days.
And what was the other prerequisite?
Morse code.
Oh, the Morse code. Okay. In America, the way they did it is they give you the Morse code test first, to see whether you should even sit for the exam. Did they do it that way, or did you take you did the theory course, theory exam first, and then do the Morse code? Yeah,
it was a theory exam. You sat down and you were in there for an hour and a half, 2 hours, writing copious notes. Yeah.
And you also drew schematics, if they...
Yeah, but very, very simple schematics.
Like a Hartley oscillator
circuits.
Or coal pits.
Yeah, very, very basic stuff. Nothing too complicated at all. But that was the next step. But in the UK at that time, they changed the licensing conditions, and they introduced two levels of license. Previously to about 1967, 66, 67, you had to go through and have the theoretical license, theoretical pass plus the Morse test. Subsequent to about 1966, thereabouts, there were 2 levels of license. Full HF license with full power on all bands if you had the Morse test and the theoretical paper, or VHF, UHF only license with no Morse code requirements. So it limited you to 2 meters, 144 megahertz, or 70 centimeters, 70 centimeters. And once I got my pink ticket, I'll call that pink ticket, I got my G8 license back in 1967, 68. So it was the first step on the ladder. But at that stage, I didn't have a Morse code.
Okay, so you got your first license, which was the VHF, UHF only.
Yep.
In America, we call that the technician class license, which had a prerequisite of 5 words a minute on the Morse code. But in the UK, what did you do with that license? How did you operate then?
Well, I built a number of receive converters to down convert the VHF and UHF bands to be received on my shortwave radio. And I built a small transmitter by modifying a piece of surplus equipment to operate on 2 meters. And that was pretty much it. I didn't have much access to masts or roof space. So it was pretty much limited to portable operation, very simple antennas. It wasn't until I went to university in North Wales that the next stage of my amateur evolution happened. Probably between 68 and 71. There was a lot going on. You're studying, and there wasn't as much time for doing a lot of ham radio activity. But I joined the radio club at Bangor University, and that was interesting because we had a lot of facilities available because it was electronics course. Through my ham radio interest, developed a
professional
interest in going down that as a career.
And so what did you major in? Were you a double E?
Electronic engineering and materials science. So semiconductor technology and applied engineering, basically. Yeah.
Because you had this degree in electrical engineering and materials science, did you follow the semiconductor route through your career? And what did that look like? Where did you go to work?
Yeah, yes and no, I think is the answer to that. I was looking for avenues initially in radio manufacture, radio engineering, and I was offered a position at the Marconi Radio Company, their headquarters in Chelmsford in the UK. And it was quite interesting, but when I left the university, I was also placed down at Plessey Company in Hull. That company was starting to move forward with digital communication, data communication, and it seemed to be a much more interesting way forward. So after the university period, I moved down to Poole in Dorset, worked for the Plessey Company, specialized in a number of areas of digital communication, designing digital modems, working on the introduction of barcode systems for libraries, hospital data collection systems, also barcoding people and drugs and that sort of thing. It was an evolving market in those days, and it's fast moving. And the interesting thing was a small company who just introduced a new semiconductor device. It was the Intel 4004, the Intel's first 4-bit computer in 1971 in Plessey, put into effectively a portable data capture unit. That was an interesting period of electronic component evolution, because no sooner had you completed a design using one piece of Intel equipment, and they'd come out with the 8008 to replace the 4004. And as soon as you got that piece of engineering done, they'd come out with the 8080, which did everything that you designed your piece of equipment in the previous 12 months. So it was a really fast-moving piece of my career, learning about microprocessors and the evolution of microprocessors. That was the first part of the career. But at the same time, there was a lot going on in manufacturing. And in that particular part of the UK, automatic test equipment was the focus. And there was a company called Membrane who made automatic test equipment for boards, electronic circuit boards. And I moved from Plessey to the Membrane, started working on the introduction of very sophisticated board test equipment, and subsequent to that, into semiconductor testing. Kind of comes full circle to the material science aspect.
Yeah, that was a fascinating, well, I guess every year gets more fascinating, but that was a fascinating period of time as I remember it as well. I remember the 4004, a friend of mine made a 4004 computer that he would clock the data through with toggle switches, on each, 4 toggle switches and a push button, to clock each half a byte through the, through the processor. So it was a very interesting time. And I think we were all also thinking maybe even those days, how to make a repeater control system out of, as you say, an 8008, but then there's the Z80, I think that came out about the same time. So it was an amazing time, and hams were on the cutting edge of, it seemed to me at those times, of computing as it was, coming down the
enthusiasm for electronic design was the thing that, if you were a radio ham, you kind of had a natural empathy for electronics. I think that's the best way of putting it. And just as a little aside, we were about 20 engineers in that department in Plessey, fresh out of college. We were being taught what to do, and we went through the mill. But one of the engineers that worked in the same office as me, as I did, was Tim Berners-Lee, now Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. And I remember we used to talk in the evenings, about half a dozen of us, what can we do with these microprocessors? There must be more than we can do that we're doing with Plessey. There's got to be opportunities here. So today you can see the result of all that sort of technology and enthusiasm. So
yeah, it was an amazing time. But as I think everyone agrees, these are amazing times as well. So I think my father once told me in his 94 years that he went from single engine airplanes, that was the warplane, pre World War II, and then the whole electronics revolution and the computers and all that stuff. And I think that was a period of time, or at least our generation and maybe his, to see the most growth in technology in the history of the world. So those were fascinating times. Tell me, where did ham radio play in this, this professional adventure? Was it, in parallel to your professional career?
Yeah, largely in parallel. But one of the group leaders I started to work for in Plessey was a radio ham as well. So that kind of helped. He was my boss, and there's a sort of an empathy there. But yes, it was always in parallel. It was always in parallel. It was never a sort of part of my career path. And it was an escapism as well, really. I could tinker with electronics at my own pace, and that's the way I liked it. Yeah.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. Was there some innovation that you might make in a home workshop that you could bring back to Plessey or back to work that kind of allowed you to kind of leapfrog over, the 8 to 5 development environment? You know what I'm saying is when you're off the clock and you're tinkering.
Well, you're never off the clock because you don't go home early. We never used to work 9 to 5. We ended up, doing what was necessary, and often you'd stay for longer, and you may do a bit of a project on the bench at the end of the day, which is maybe not work related. The two sort of helped move projects that you were working on forward. That enthusiasm of working together, the challenge, if I can put it like that. Yeah.
Now you have we're doing actually a video conference here on Google Meet, and you have your back to your ham radio station, and you have radios from different periods of your life, it looks like, on your active workbench or your active ham station. Could you talk a little bit about, have you collected the radios of your past, or are these the radios of your past that you just haven't gotten rid of? And can you explain a little bit about what you've got there?
Yeah, I had an interest, I suppose, from about the mid-90s, going to swap meets and radio rallies. I developed an interest in Eddystone radios, with the big, large slide rule dial. And I started to collect those radios over a period of about 10 or 15 years. And there were a number of collectors of Eddystone radios, and there's an Eddystone radio in those days, back in the sort of 1990s. There was an Eddystone radio group formed, largely out of people who've been part of the Eddystone company that wound up. And I started to collect the Eddystone radios, and a lot of them they'd been modified, they didn't work. And I enjoyed looking into the history, the circuitry of those radios and bringing them back to life and doing what I call a reasonable job on the restoration of them. And I suppose I had about 15 Eddystone radios in the end. I had them on a big rack, and I'm quite proud of them. But as you get on in time, you need to pass them on to new custodians, people who look after them and keep them going. So my Eddystone radio collection has dwindled now to one Eddystone radio, which is the EA12, which is the amateur-only bands version of the one of their communications receivers. Apart from that, my other interest is the radios from the KW Electronics company. KW Electronics was manufacturer of HF radios and transmitters. Started in my mid-50s. A chap called Rolly Shears, G8KW. I think his partner Ken Ellis, G5KW. They made a range of transmitters, KW Vanguard, KW Valiant, KW 160, AM transmitters. Mm-hmm. And they made the first single sideband transmitter, the KW Viceroy. They subsequently followed that up with, let's say, the British equivalent of the KW-M2, the Collins transceiver. Slightly more amateurish than the Collins in its construction, but nonetheless a very, very capable transceiver, 160 meters through to 10 meters. And when I was at university, the university radio station was a 1963-64 KW 2000. We used to operate that from very high spot tower on the university building, 160-meter contests using very, very long antennas from the tower of this castle-like building in Bangor. For nostalgic reasons, I always wanted one of these radios later on in my life, and managed to acquire a KW 2000 using 6146 PA valve. And it came from a gentleman who's also in the RAF, and he'd had it for a long, long time. And he was familiar with Rolly Shears at KW Electronics. And this particular KW transceiver, which actually I'm looking at now behind the laptop, serial number 5. It's one of the very, very earliest working KW 2000 transceivers that we're aware of. Subsequent to that, I managed to acquire a KW 2000A, which was sort of 1964 onwards. And the radio that's sitting on top of the KW Atlanta is a KW 2000B, which was 1967, 68, that sort of period. So I've currently got 3 operational KW 2000 and the KW Atlanta, which is very similar to the Swan 500 that we were discussing previously.
Even has the same color scheme as the Swan radios, almost like the black and gray. Yeah,
even the dial is two-tone, boys blue band in there. Very, very similar indeed. It's not quite as nicely made mechanically, but the circuit is virtually identical to the Swan 500, and it's got a nice crystal filter. The KW 2000s all have a mechanical filter in them, and the mechanical filters is the Achilles heel of the KW 2000, because whilst the mechanical element is quite strong, which I can show Eric.
Yeah, so you're holding up the filter.
I'm holding up the various elements, mechanical elements on a rod. Mm-hmm. It's about 2 inches long or 5 centimeters. But when it's packaged inside a can, it's packaged in a foam rubber jacket,
right?
Which is great for the first 10 years of its life. But these things we've found to degrade, the foam rubber degrades into like a goo. And after 20 or 30 years, that goo then starts to have an effect on the filter, and the radio becomes, the transmit and receive paths are both attenuated seriously. So you either have to operate on the filter and be very, very careful doing that, or replace it with a modern burrata sort of ceramic filter, which there are a number still available. So, yeah.
Now, did KW Electronics, did they make only amateur radio gear, or did they also make commercial gear?
They were primarily between the 50s and the late 60s, ham radio. They were taken over, I think, in about 1974 by Decca. And I think they did go on to do some commercial work later on in the company's history, but primarily in the period I was aware of them, it was purely amateur gear. Yeah.
Now, you talk a little bit in your QRZ page that you've made some changes to your ham station. So you went from, it looked like a Kenwood or big Kenwood transceiver, and now you've got an ICOM SDR transceiver in your shack. But one of the things I thought was interesting is that you said that you went from a 3-element Cushcraft beam on a Versa tower. So you'll have to tell us what a Versa tower is. And now that you're using a 66-foot end-fed half-wave antenna, how is the quality of your communications and the user experience? How has that changed by changing out, what everybody wants is the tower and beam and going with an end-fed wire?
Yeah, well, I got planning permission to put up a tower with a beam on it just before 2000. And so I always had just the odd wire antenna out before, and it was always a bit of a challenge to try and get any what I call sensible DX, because I wasn't using Morse code, and I haven't used Morse code really very much in my amateur career. Just going back a step, I did pass the 12 word per minute Morse code exam at the Coast Guard radio station in 1971 while I was at the university. So in 1971, I got my G3ZDQ call sign. But I've not really used Morse code seriously. So I was using single sideband, and I'd always sort of hoped I could get a beam antenna. So I eventually bit the bullet and took the planning forms in for approval, and I managed to get some support because the local councillors started to appreciate the value of amateur radio in emergency communication, because out here in the relatively sparsely populated Dorset, there are some areas, particularly on the coastline, where emergency communication is very, very difficult. The VHF communications that were available in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was literally restricted line of sight. So if you're in a difficult location with an emergency, it was problematic. And I think they started to value the flexibility of amateur radio communication. We've got communications tools at our disposal that we can, say, throw together, what we can put together at very short notice and relocate to wherever, and very quickly have a radio communication system in place, either point to point or point to several points. And I think the councillors and the county emergency planning people here in Dorset actually started to appreciate that aspect of the hobby. And there was an event in my life that I remember, and that was in June 1967. There was an air crash in Stockport, which is the nearest town to my home. It was probably it still is the fourth worst air crash in UK history. But the telephone communication and the police communication were literally overrun within a very short period of time. And there was, in that area, a group of radio hams that formed a group that was affiliated to the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network UK, and they were used in part to provide communications in support of the activities that were going on at that time. And I always remember that. And I joined the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network very shortly after that. When I came down to Dorset, I asked whether there was a Raynet in Dorset. There wasn't. And I was part of the Bournemouth Radio Club at the time. And we decided that it would be a good idea if we tried to get some interest in the county. And for better or for worse, I was proposed as the county controller for Dorset Raynet. So for a period of about 6 years, 7 years, I was county controller at Raynet. We were visiting all the local radio clubs, Bournemouth Radio Club, Poole Radio Club, South Dorset, Blackmore Vale, what they could do to help in case of a disaster. And we managed to get a group of about 30 or 40 people interested, and that group still exists today. There are five separate groups in the county now, more distributed, but they take part in training exercises with the Red Cross, county emergency planning people, training exercises in support of activities like the Ironman and those sort of things. So we were, as in the States, amateur support for communities in the time of disaster is very valued on here in the UK. Yeah.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Well, that's pretty cool. So you got the tower, you got the beam, and now you no longer have the tower and the beam.
No, as you get old, you start to look at the... I've got, let's say I had 30 pieces of radio equipment. You think, what's going to happen to these? So you start to whittle them down. And we're starting to think, well, should we be moving in the next 4 or 5 years? People get older, they downsize.
Right.
And I thought, if anything happens to me, who's going to take this tower down?
Yeah, that's right.
So I said to my wife, it's time. Let's take the tower down, and then we've got no impediment to the next phase of what we want to do. And years ago, I took the tower down and gone to someone else that could use it.
So how has it affected your user experience? Do you miss the tower and the beam, or have you? I mean, you and I met on FT8. So what I do when I'm operating FT8 now is depending upon where the ham is or whatever, I'll push the link on my logging software that takes me to the QRZ page. So, Ian, that's how I, ended up sending you an invitation for QSO Today, because I saw your fabulous QRZ page with all the pictures and all the things you were doing. So I know you're operating FT8. Are you operating, I guess, are you finding the same enjoyment now with the end-fed wire that you were finding with the beam and the tower?
Well, I suppose when I was using the beam and the tower, I was largely operating on 15 and 20 meters and occasionally on 10 when the band conditions were good. I was able to work all over the States, all over Canada. I was working into the Far East and Australia and that. So that was okay. Now I don't have that. I've come down, I'm using an end-fed wire, and I'm using it on 40 meters, and it's a different group of people on 40 meters. There's slightly more local people, and the QSOs are more a bit like we're having a conversation now. You get to know people a bit more. I like to have a communication when we talk about things rather than the very quick contest type 5 and 9. Thanks very much. So, in the wintertime, I pick up my, particularly in January, put the KW radios on the air. Mm-hmm. There's an event called KW Days that's usually about the first weekend in January. And all the KW enthusiasts bring out their KW rigs and operate them. So, I operate these radios on single sideband. These are 7610 on single sideband, mainly on 40, sometimes 20 and 15. I dip in and out of different modes. And the nice things about the hobby that, I can be doing a bit of restoration for a few weeks on the radio, and I get really enthusiastic about that and get really into it. And then at the end of that, I'll go back to, and I'll be shortwave listening while I'm doing that. But after that, I'll go and do a bit of operating on single sideband. And I saw, over the last few years with this change towards having another aspect of the hobby, which is digital communication. That kind of came about in another roundabout way, really. You remember I talked about Raynet and emergency communication. Well, after my period in Raynet, during the period in Raynet, we were radio mapping the county, know where the radio black spots were, and we were able to put radio mobile repeaters in high spots to actually allow relay of messages from point A to point B to affect good communications link in difficult areas. And after I stopped my period with Raynet, I got involved with the repeater groups locally. We have a number of repeater groups in and around Dorset, all over the UK, like you do in the States and Israel and various places. And I got involved in supporting the 2 meter and 70 centimeter analog repeater. Operated mobile as part of my Raynet activities on 2 meters and 4 meters. And then the next period of evolution was there were two things happening. I think internet-linked repeaters, IRLP, came in. I set up a little repeater. I had an internet-linked repeater capability here in the Radio Shack, so I could operate from my 77 handy to my radio here in the shack. I could tunnel down the internet and pop up in Canada or the USA and talk to people in that locality. And that was an interesting period as well, because I got friends in Canada, and I was able to keep in communication with them that way when HF communication just wasn't possible. And then there was the move towards adding Echo Link onto the repeaters. And then the next phase was to have purely digital repeaters. So I got involved in supporting digital repeaters and analog repeaters locally. And then, of course, PSK 31, all the various digital formats, FD4, FD8, and so on. And I started to experiment with digital communications with my Yaesu 5000. You could add bits onto it to make it do digital communications, but it was a big, heavy beast. And I decided it would be better to have something that was a bit lighter to manage, a bit more up to date. Changed the 5000, which is a lovely transmitter receiver, lovely transceiver, for the 7610. I'm really pleased with. It's a superb radio. I just love it. And that gave me the opportunity to explore FT8. And so I'd started down that path and sort of conquered how to get it going and how to interface it to my logbook, which is Ham Radio Deluxe, and then to add other tools like Grid Tracker to map the reports coming back from PSK 31. I was able to benefit from studying propagation and antennas. I use Whisper, WSPR, weak signal propagation reporting, to look at how my antennas are performing, my end-fed half wave. And more recently, I put up a DX Commander vertical. Nothing too massive. It's only about just over 6 meters high. That operates on all bands from 40 through to 6 meters. It's great. You can put a Whisper station together, connect it to the antenna, and with 5 watts, you can see that using these weak signal propagation modes, you're being heard in Australia, New Zealand, Alaska, down in Antarctica, and you can see the pattern that the antenna is achieving different times of the day. So, I'm benefiting because I'm educating myself in propagation, and the same is true of FD8. I mean, when I put a CQ call out on FD8, you can see all these reports coming back from the PSK 31 reporter,
right,
into Grid Tracker. It's a tremendous tool for anybody that wants to experiment with antennas and propagation. I don't think it's the death knell that everybody reports for ham radio. It's just another tool, because I think the Antique Wireless Association of America, nail on the head, they changed the name of the Radio Museum in Bloomfield, New York, quite recently to Radio Communications Technologies Museum. I think that basically sums up where we are with ham radio. You know, we're enthusiasts in radio communications technology. Part of that's using the microphone and chatting. Part of it's delving into designs and coming up with innovative circuits and ideas. Part of it is using new emerging technologies. You know, I can't fabricate an FPGA or, highly integrated design myself anymore, but I can use the modules that other people put and link them together with software, which is what FT8 is. It's an application of these emerging technologies that we've been presented with. I think that's where ham radio is, and that's the way to stimulate the young people. You know, not to just pigeonhole it into the 1920s Morse code technology. It's how it's evolved over the years.
Well, I didn't think that when I had an IC 7300 and I sold it by mistake to buy something else, and then I just bought another one, and I didn't think that I would enjoy the digital modes as much as I am enjoying it, because FT8 seems kind of like addictive. You know, my wife will say, dinner's ready, and I'll say, okay, I'm coming, and then, I make a contact on FT8, and I figure, you know what, things are okay, I'll just make another one, and it's like this, party drug, where you just have to keep making, more CQs on the one hand. On the other hand, exactly as you say, I didn't think my inverted V, I've got a random wire inverted V with a ladder line and a tuner at the bottom. And I didn't think that it would work as well as it's working, but if I use PSK Reporter or I do WhisperNet like you're mentioning, then my antenna is like omnidirectional and working everywhere. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really cool. So now I've become interested in antenna propagation and playing with, if I move the end of the antenna around, does it make any difference? My lot is kind of small, so, the antenna, in fact, is not an inverted V that's going straight down to tie points. It's actually wrapping around the yard in a couple of places in order to stay inside the yard. And so I've become kind of like, yeah, this is really, it's a very nice additional aspect to the hobby that I didn't think that I would enjoy so much. But I've always been kind of a builder first, and I think I've been on the air more now in the last few months than I've ever been in the last 50 years. So it's been quite enjoyable. An interesting thing, an interesting aside is that I've got my logging software connected to my QRZ page. So every time I make a contact, it updates the QRZ logging. And so what happens is that I've made like 600 contacts in the last couple of months. And so QRZ sends you a message. They say, well, you're eligible for these awards. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. Now they're kind of, weirdly stated, you're the master of communication for Europe or whatever, because you've made these contacts. So I'm eligible for 3. So I put myself in for 3. And then I get a message, okay, well, you got them. And then you go to the page where you've got them, and they say, well, it's 66 shekels, which is probably at this point like $21, $22 or something like that for each of these awards in order to get the certificate with your name on it. And I thought, oh, what an amazing entrepreneurial idea this is, for QRZ, because, it hooks you in. Am I going to buy, $60 worth of award certificates to, plaster on my wall? Well, maybe, but
I've got the same.
It's fun,
I use Ham Radio Deluxe, and it tracks awards. And I made some good contacts with the beam, but I didn't get DXCC or anything. I wasn't operating enough, to be quite honest. But I've done a lot more with FT8, and you get quite a lot of QSL, apart from the confirmation that you get back that you've actually made a contact. I use EQSL as well, and quite often you'll get a QSL within an hour or two of you actually making the contact.
Right.
And they are quite interesting if they're personal to the individual that's sending it. There's some generic types that are not quite so interesting, but you've actually got something like, you've seen my...
Yeah. Your QSL card.
QSL.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, with the old KW 2000 on there, and it's also got the historic, which is just in the background. You can't see it. Yeah, this is the single valve transmitter.
Your Hartley transmitter, right?
The Hartley transmitter.
Hartley oscillator transmitter. Could you that was going to be one of my questions, that if we're looking at it, at least I saw on the QOZ page, but essentially it's you've got a piece of oak or something like that, and this thing is mounted on top of it, or walnut or whatever. It looks like a period piece from the 20s. Breadboard, right. Yeah. It's a breadboard radio.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in building that, and how did you find enough of the components look like they're from the period? Is that by design in terms of, do you actually find components from the period, or do you actually fabricate those components to look like they're from the period?
We used to go to a number of, let's say, what meets and rallies, and struck a friendship with a guy called Jim Taylor, G4ERU. Jim was, when I met him, he was in his 80s. I used to visit him, 2 or 3 times a year at his Radio Shack, and if he wanted something doing, I'd go and do work on the antenna and so on and so forth, and got to know him quite well. And it turns out he was, apart from being a radio ham and very enthusiastic motor car enthusiast, he was an antique radio dealer, and he was a member of the British Vintage Wireless Association, and he used to trade in some quite what I call important radios, Marconi artifacts from the day. And I quite often go over, and he like when he was in his mid 80s, there's a box of stuff there. It's going in the skip. You can have it, and I'd take it home, and it'll be it's a box of valves or valve bases or components. Some of them were Eddystone components, which I was interested in. So I amassed a small collection of vintage radio components from Jim. And they were just stuck in the top of the garage in the boxes that they came in. There weren't many, it was 2 or 3 boxes, but they were components from the 20s. And I was a member of the Eddystone radio group in those days. And on one of the bulletin boards one day, somebody popped up and says, anybody got any beehive insulators? And I remembered I got some in this collection of bits from Jim. I'm not going to do anything with them. So I said, yeah, I've got some, you can have them. He came back and said, I'm in Ontario in Canada. I said, well, if you pay the postage, you can still have them. So I put them in a box and sent them off to the chap called Lou Van Mund, VE3AWA. And I thought nothing more of it. And I got a very nice email saying, thank you very much, they've arrived. And about 3 weeks later, box turned up on the back doorstep. When I opened it, there was a valve in there. I think it was a UX171A triode from the 1928. And a scrap of paper on it saying, you don't fancy making a transmitter, do you? Well, we all like a challenge. And I started to communicate with Lou, and he made some extremely nice vintage transmitters, tune plate, tune grid transmitters using triodes, wound with beautiful coils, immaculate engineering. And I joined the American Wireless Association and got to know a few of the things going on there. And each year they have an event called the Bruce Kelly Memorial QSO Party. And it takes place in, I think, November this year, 2 weekends in November. And if you have a piece of transmitting equipment that's made using circuit components pre-1929, you're eligible to enter the QSO party. It's like a contest, but you've got to have a radio, a transmitter that was built pre-1929, a circuit that was of the time. Quite interesting. And that's how I came to research the various designs that were available at that time, and came across this whole Hartley transmitter, single valve transmitter, and I amassed the components together from Jim Taylor's box of bits and built myself a 6L6 programmable HP power supply of the period, using valves.
Mm-hmm.
And I had myself 4-watt CW 40-meter transmitter. And Lou and I tried for quite a few months, 6 months, maybe a year, to get a contact across the Atlantic. But like me, we just had an NFED and he had an inverted V, and we could never hear each other because he was using a 10-watt tune grid tune plate transmitter and I was using the Hartley. And we'd email each other and listen, but nothing. But a colleague of his in the group, Tom Motes, KN4RRQ, was also interested, and he built himself for a push-pull Type 27 transmitter. Hartley, and he said, I'd like to have a go to communicate with you. So we set up a sched around about midnight on 40 meters, as the band conditions were changing. And he'd text me as to when he was on the band, and we'd listen. We tried for about 3 months. I mean, there's occasional periods when I could hear something. The sound of a Hartley, it chirps and it whoops and it buzzes. And it's nothing like modern CW. And I think in June 2021, around about midnight, I can't remember the exact times now, I heard the distinct tone of the Hartley for Tom's Hartley coming through. And I actually read his call sign signal. It's about strength 2. Is it something like a 254? A very, very weak signal. But Tom was receiving me on a beverage antenna. He has a horse ranch out in West Virginia, called Floyd in West Virginia. And he was able to put a very long beverage antenna pointing right at me in the UK. And he gave me a 457 report. It wasn't a very good signal tone, but he gave me a 457 report. And so we barely made contact, but the excitement of that must have been very similar to Mr. Marconi when he made that first transatlantic hop, back in whenever it was, 1912. And it's the challenge that is interesting. And going back to what we were saying about the tower, if you throw $1,000 at a tower and $5,000 at the transmitting equipment, you can make contacts. You just plug the boxes in, you make contacts. But if you come back to QRP wire antennas, the challenge and the excitement of actually achieving something is, I think, far greater. And I'm enjoying, playing around with QRP, with FT8. I made contact with Japan the other day, and I thought, well, yes, that's brilliant. And they were calling me.
Amazing. You bring up QRP, and one of the things I like about, I've loved about doing the QSO Today podcast since 2014 is what I learn in the process of researching the episode. So one of the things I noticed, you mentioned that you do QRP from a canal boat. Now, I didn't know anything about canal boats before today, and I didn't know anything about the fact that there are inland canals in the UK. So I started researching that and discovered that there's a map online that looks like the London Underground. If you were applying it to the entire UK and the canal system that's there. So you mentioned that you like to operate, and you just held up your portable, that you like to operate QRP from canal boats on the inland waterways in the United Kingdom. So I'm going to put some links in the show notes page for people to see what I discovered if they didn't know that the UK had canals. But can you talk a little bit about, do you own a canal boat or do you rent a canal boat? How does that work? And then when you're on the canals, where do you go and how do you operate?
Yeah, I grew up on the canals in the north of England, grew up very close to the Peak Forest Canal. I used to go fishing on there, and then I got a canoe and had a canoe on the canals going back to, when I was a teenager. So I always had an affinity for canals, and, the canals were the backbone of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, and there's over 2,000 miles of waterways in the UK. You can connect pretty much all the major cities in the UK with the canal network. And I was fortunate enough to buy my own canal boat back in 2005. So for the last 20 years, I've been out and about on the canal network, and quite often I'll take my ICOM 817 QRP rig or today, it's the ICOM 705 I use. And a little vertical antenna, trap vertical antenna, often working, 40 meters, 20 meters, occasionally 15. It's amazing what you can achieve. And it's a pretty good ground plane. A steel narrowboat is a pretty good ground plane. The only problem is, if you've got a portable vertical antenna on, you think it would be omnidirectional. It's very much directional to the way in which the boat and the canal are orientated. So it's like having a big beam, but you've got to point the ship in the right direction.
And the canals are narrow, so you're going to have to make a turn someplace, right, in order to change the direction.
Yeah, the canal, there are what they call winding holes, areas where in the old days they used to turn the canal boats around because they were all horse-drawn. Going back in the day in the 1700s, 1800s, the canal boats were pulled by horse. And they had lots of wharfs in towns and in the countryside as well. So, it's a bit like the motorway system of today, enabled tremendous amount of produce to be moved from A to B, heavy produce, iron ore, coal, sort of product would be moved in canal boats in the 17 and 1800s. And sadly, in the 1900s, after the Second World War, the waterways went into decline. But like amateur radio, there's a group of enthusiasts that got together and they put effort into restoring the network of canal locks, and many of the canals that were abandoned back in the 1950s and 60s are now fully operational. And so there's over 2,000 miles of waterways, and quite often we see.
I went down the rabbit hole today looking to see if there were canal boat vacations, if there's kosher catering on canal boat vacations. So, because it looked like, what a fascinating idea. I can't get my wife to go on a cruise because, she's easily seasick. But it seemed to me, the canals would be a great way to spend, an interesting who does it? I'm sure lots of people do it, but I don't know anybody that ever has. So I thought, well, that's a very interesting idea for a vacation, would be to do a canal vacation between, various points in the UK. These are not naturally occurring. All of these were dug, right?
They're all dug, yeah. They often link into waterways as well. So river systems, the natural river systems are sort of linked together with these man-made waterways that are literally dug out by steam shovel and hand. And many of the canals follow the contour of the land, so you end up going on quite significant journeys rather than from point A to point B. But it's a very beautiful landscape, and the maximum speed is typically 4 miles an hour. So unlike the modern rat race, you do step off the real world, and you can turn your mobile phone off, and you can isolate yourself from the rat race that surrounds you, and just operate at a different pace. It's a different sort of, and I was jetting off all around the world in my career, and I look back on the canals as a sort of a way of just having a little bit of me time, a bit of peace and quiet.
Now, was your canal boat, was it used for family vacations as well? Does your wife like to go with you on the canal journeys? Always, yeah. So someone's got to drive the boat, right, while you're operating the 705.
No. I drive the boat. My wife opens the locks. It's all the heavy lifting she does.
And because they have locks is because the elevation changes.
Yeah, it's a system of allowing the canals to navigate hills or changes in the land. Quite often you'll have a lock that will allow, so you have a gate at either end, and you close the gate at the lower end, allow water to flow in from the upper end, and you can adjust typically anything up to 30 feet, something like that.
Amazing.
I mean, most locks are 60, 10, but it's a very simple way of allowing changes in the topology of the land to be navigated. It's interesting because you meet people at locks, you meet other canal boaters, and you have an interchange and exchange. It's a bit like ham radio. You meet people. It's very nice.
Now, I'm curious, the ham in me would say, now do canal boats have like ADS-B? I mean, can you follow canal boat journeys on the internet like you can aircraft?
Oh, very much so. There's lots of canal YouTube channels.
No, I'm saying is like aircraft have a beacon that has an ID number.
Oh, no.
So do canal boats have a beacon with an ID number so that you can see where your boat is at? And
no, the most complicated technology is usually the battery. You have to put an Apple tag on or something like that to actually track a canal boat.
Oh, interesting.
No, there's no mandate to have an identity system. You do have to have a license, and the license costs quite a lot of money. It's about £1,000 a year for a canal boat license, so it's
really
not cheap. So.
For a canal boat driver or for the canal boat itself?
It's to put the canal onto the waterways.
So
it's
I
for
see.
The boat, yeah. So ham radio is a lot better. It's a lot cheaper.
Oh, is that right? What excites you the most, Ian, about ham radio now? Are you able to put your finger on something that excites you the most?
I think it's a challenge. It's just a challenge. I've seen this tremendous spectrum of technology emerge, and if you're open to embracing it and to dipping into bits of it, I think that's what excites me most, because just look at the 50 years that I've been around, 50, 60 years I've been a radio ham. What's happened? I was born sort of 40 years after Marconi first made contact across the Atlantic. Who would have thought television, personal computers, all these things would have evolved? We've got opportunities with the gigahertz bands. We've got opportunities with space. We've got Earth communication, satellites. There's so many satellites up in the air now. Quite a proportion of those are amateur radio satellites. Some of them are just to use video communication like we're doing now, but using radio technology. I mean, the scope of amateur radio, and I keep coming back to this, communications technologies, it's just evolving all the time. And you don't have to encompass all of it, but it's nice to be able to dip into different bits of it and educate yourself and maybe throw yourself out the odd challenge. For one of the things I've noticed here living out in the countryside is the level of interference has gone up enormously as houses have got built around, as broadband signals on the telephone wires created interference. It's like having the fog creep up around you, and try and pick aspects of the technology to help you achieve communications over longer distances reliably. The 7610's got wonderful filtering in it. The digital modes allow you to communicate over long distances with very little power because it's accurate. I don't know where we're going to be in 20 years' time. I really don't.
And hopefully we'll both be here to see where that is. Do you have any advice to new returning hams before we go?
Returning hams, people like me who've maybe been away from the hobby for 20 years, be flexible. The range of radios you can pick up now, they're not expensive. You don't have to have the top of the range radio. The 7300 that we were talking about, it's just got its next generation. The Mark II is just coming on the market. There's got to be loads of 7300 Mark Is available that are capable of doing digital communication, single sideband, Morse code. Join an organization like the Radio Society of Great Britain or the ARRL, one of the associations where you can associate yourself with other people like-minded who will help you. I've got people made friends with 20 years ago that we're still friends. We see each other half a dozen times a year, maybe less. But, you learn what they're doing. I have one friend who's just set up a digital repeater. I've got another who's doing video communication via satellites. And you think, that's interesting. I could do that. The scope is endless, really. And
for older people, it may stall off memory problems and dementia and stuff like this, right? Because you're always researching, you're always using new brain cells. So if you're a retiree, there's no shortage of things that you could be learning.
No, I mean, on 80 meters every morning on 3.760 in the UK, there's an 80-meter net that starts at some unearthly hour in the morning called a horizontal net. And these people who get up early and they chat to each other, and then it evolves into another net. There are lots of nets that you can get involved in. It's just, social support you need if you're getting on. It's nice to have that group of people. They're not competing with each other. They're not going on to mountaintops seeking awards and that sort of thing, unless that's what you want to do.
Right.
But, I listen to the YouTube channel that's put on the channel by K4SWL. Thomas. Thomas is Parks on the Air, and he's a very interesting character. And if you can't get out and about operating, then there are people like him that can provide that experience in a video channel. It gets you out and about. You can see the equipment. You've got an hour of CW in real time. So if you can't achieve some of the technical things the practical things that younger people can, there are so many different aspects of the hobby that shortwave listening. You can pick up a radio, put a short antenna on it, tune the knob, and it's not complicated.
Ian, it's been really a pleasure to have this QSO with you today. I'm so glad that I have this new idea of pushing the look at the QRZ page when I'm making FT8 contacts, because that's how I found you, and I'm so glad that I did. I had a wonderful hour and 10 minutes here. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you for coming on QSO Today.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having the QSO with me today, Eric. It's been very pleasant talking to you. It's been very pleasant seeing you. And, I've listened to a number of the QSO Today podcast, and it's amazing how similar the experiences are of people like myself and yourself and the others. They've come through that period.
You're my first canal boat captain. Yeah.
Well, perhaps see you on the canals then in the UK. You never know.
There you go. I'll let you know when I arrive. 73.
G3ZDQ clear.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ian. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G3ZDQ in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.